Started here. All right, we're going to get started here in just a couple of minutes. For those that are attending the Hangout live, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, tell us where you're from. And for people watching offline, generally what we're going to do is collect questions from people. We're going to let people get logged in. So if you're watching this offline, you may want to fast forward to maybe about 10 minutes by the time we get people's questions collected. We have people that had sent in a number of questions. But again, if you're watching live, please feel free to introduce yourself. Tell us where you're from. It's always interesting. All right, so we have some people logging in. So from Plainfield, Illinois. We have some from the UK. We have Greece being represented. All right. And again, if you have questions, you could enter them in the comments field. All right. We have Paris. Beautiful city. So those people kind of watching it offline may want to fast forward. We're going to do some introductions. We're going to do questions. We had people that had sent questions in advance, so that's always helpful. All right, we have Mexico, from London, Brazil, Columbia, South Carolina. That's great. I haven't been there in a little while. Beautiful little city. South Korea, Thailand, Macedonia, Arizona, but currently in Houston. So you went from hot to hotter, probably. All right. All right, Newport, Rhode Island, Denmark, France. And for those people logging in, if you have questions, please feel free to enter your questions in the comments field. All right, Serbia. Okay, so see a question on warping. All right, so we're seeing some questions come in. Brooklyn, Trinidad, Tobago. All right, so yeah, we see a comment about the user groups at Chuck's. So yeah, we do that every first Saturday. It was just there last Saturday, but we'll be there, I think, over Labor Day weekend as well. Okay, seeing some questions coming in. I'm just going to go ahead and copy some of these over. So we're just collecting questions from people. So thanks for all the great questions. All right, so some more people getting logged in. Get started here in just a couple minutes. Make sure getting all of our questions collected. All right, so Greg from Olympic Peninsula and beautiful Pacific Northwest in Washington State. Good to see you again. All right, a couple more people are getting logged in. See some more questions I'm copying over. We'll get started here in a minute. Okay, just copying over some. All right, so some more people getting logged in. To people that have questions or just getting logged in, if you want to enter them in the comments field. And also for the people who are just getting logged in, if you want to just do a quick introduction, tell us where you're from. We'll get started here in just a minute. Got a lot of great questions. All right, and one more time before we get started, if there's a quick question you want to enter, you get ask questions in the comments field as we kind of are going through. So, but we'll get started here in just about a minute. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks to everyone for your wonderful questions. We have a couple questions that we could kind of cover perhaps at the top. All right. All right, just copying over a couple questions that just came in. I won't be able to send a coffee over to Paris, so sorry. It was a question. Question on, do we upload the Hangouts on the channel? They are available to stream afterwards. So within a couple of hours, the whole Hangout will be available to be viewed afterwards, and you can watch it over and over again. So I had a question if I'm using Equator audio monitors, and someone just got a pair. I think they're the best near fields ever. I've seen them used in a lot of studios. Like I remember Teddy Riley had a pair early on, being in his studio. He liked them quite a bit too. Okay, just one last question and copy over, then we'll get started. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. We'll collect questions as we go through the Hangout as well. So a couple questions. I think there's one related to 32-bit plugins, if there's a solution for 32-bit plugins, and we kind of cover this on every Hangout, it seems. But with Cubase 9, it went 64-bit only. And we'd spent, probably over 10 years bridging different plugins. So if you wanted to still use older plugins or 32-bit, you can. A common solution is to get a third-party solution like JBridge. So that would be a really good third-party solution. I think it might be $30 ish. I'm not quite sure. I haven't used 32-bit plugins in a while personally, but JBridge will still work, and other bridging technologies will still work directly within Cubase. So we didn't cut it off. We just didn't want to have to worry about bridging plugins internally. So let's go ahead through a couple other questions. We had some quick questions up top. Okay, just going through some comments coming in, questions. Give me a second here, just copy these over. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. We had a question about Absolute 2. Will that work? So it was a beginner question, and it was, how does Absolute 2 work well in Cubase Artist? As in Pro, thank you very much. I'm a beginner. So Absolute 2 is just it's a collection of Steinberg VST instruments. So it'll work the same way in Cubase Artist or Cubase Pro. So we really don't kind of differentiate how VST instruments are being used directly in a project in Cubase. So it'll work the same way. So let me go ahead and we'll go through some questions that were submitted earlier and some that were sent in advance by email. So we'll go get started now. All right, so someone had a question about the sampler track, and when they add a sampler track, that it always goes to the bottom of the project, and they're tired of scrolling all the way down. And it really kind of depends on how the sampler track was added. So if I wanted to come directly to my Cubase project here, and let's say if I created a sampler track from an event, so let's say and if I right click create sampler track here, it'll add the sampler track, but on the project window that gets added all the way to the bottom, and that's where our sampler track is. So if you want the sampler track to actually be part of the project window wherever you want it to be, all you'd have to do is, let's say if I want the sampler track to be right here, I could right click and go to add track and add sampler track. And at this point, we'll just click add track. There's our sampler track, and we could just drag and drop any audio in to our sampler window and be able to have the sampler track be played back directly there. So the sampler track, if you go to add a sampler track by right clicking here to create a sampler track, or from the actual audio editor, if you define a region, or if you just kind of drag and drop, it'll go to the bottom. But if you just manually add a sampler track at this point, just by going to the right mouse click, go to add track and choose to add sampler track, and at that point you could place the sampler track directly below the selected track. So we could add a sampler track, and now we have our two sampler tracks. So that way you could place the sampler tracks anywhere that you want it for it to be placed. All right, so someone watched one of the Q&A series videos, and that's one of the things that we're also doing, is taking like little snippets of some of these topics and questions that are, that could be really interesting for people, and doing a Q&A series of videos on the Cubase YouTube channel. So if you haven't checked those out, we have a bunch of them done and a bunch more coming. But someone saw one of the Q&A series about kind of doing like a little automation bump. And they liked that, but they wanted it to be applied to MIDI controller data. In a MIDI track. So if I wanted to, we'll just add a MIDI track here, or an instrument track, doesn't really matter. So let's say and basically what the automation bump would allow you to do is to take just a range of the audio and be able to do just to raise it just a bit. So if I have controller data, let's say I have modulation directly here. So at this point, I'll grab my pencil tool and we'll just draw in some modulation controller data. And if you wanted to actually raise just a portion of the controller, I'll just make this a little larger so it's easier to see. All you'd have to do is, with the selection tool, to just kind of raise, to select a range, and then you can just increase or decrease all the values like so. You could also tilt it if you grab it in the upper left hand corner. So if you want to tilt it down, or kind of have it do a fade in, or conversely tilt the opposite end, or if you wanted to actually just kind of compress the content, you could just go to the center area and be able to just kind of compress contents just like that. But if you wanted to just raise, you know, or lower the overall values, just select a range like so. And then if you go to the top center, you can take the selected range here. I'll just select all of it. And then as we just kind of go to the top, you can, at that point, just increase, decrease your MIDI CCs. And we could also do this for automation editing, as well as doing tempo track editing. So that same kind of, it's almost like a note expression. I often call it a note expression editing paradigm, because that's where it was first introduced, with note expression on individual notes. So, but that's an easy way to kind of mimic that behavior directly for MIDI CCs, to do like a little bump to raise or lower a range of MIDI CC values. Okay, I'm just going to check, see if there's any other questions that have come in. We're going to Okay, so we have a question that just kind of came in. Says it was actively seen when MIDI was coming in. I know a little bit about it. I have a MIDI track I want to play in Cubase. Do I just add a keyboard track to the MIDI file to play it? Really, all you have to do, if you have a MIDI track, you know, you can just come to like a new project, and let's say I'll just create empty. And at this point, if you have a MIDI file, you could directly import the MIDI file onto the track. So you could actually create a new project if you wanted to, or just import it into the existing project. But all you'd have to do to play back MIDI is to literally just add a MIDI track, and that could go out to a keyboard. If you're using virtual instruments, there's some advantages to using the instrument track. So this is going to a software instrument. This is kind of a whole paradigm that Steinberg invented. So if you wanted to add like a Retrolog synthesizer, you can now have MIDI information that plays. Now, some people, when they're first starting off, we could choose to, if you have a MIDI controller connected to the computer, you could now play the virtual instrument. Let's say I'll just load up a more interesting patch. So, or you could just simply have your MIDI track here and be able to play. If you have MIDI data already, so some people will just kind of draw notes in, and at that point, since this instrument is being sent out to Retrolog, or this MIDI track is going out to my UR44 to like a hardware piece, that sends that MIDI information directly to the instrument. So you could just literally just kind of draw notes in if you wanted to, or play it in real time via MIDI. All right, we had a question on shared clip processing, and this is a question I get periodically sent to me. So let's say if I have a drum loop, so I'm just gonna find a quick drum loop, and this can happen with drum loops or parts that are often used repeatedly. So let's say I have a drum loop here in this project, and I wanted to have multiple instances of this audio file. Now the question I got was in dealing with kind of background vocals, and the customer had used the same audio file for the background vocals and had copied it like so. So we have three repetitions of the original file here. And then what they wanted to do was on the third verse, they wanted to change the actual, they wanted to change the audio and do some processing. They wanted to add a fade out. So what we could do is actually just select a range here. And then I want to go to processing. And let's just apply fade out. We can see that we have a linear fade out. I'll choose process. Now, often we get this little window, and a lot of people just kind of hit OK to continue. But let's actually read what this window says. This project contains events that are the same audio material as is selected. Click new version of processing should apply only to the selected events. So with this window open, when I actually look at it, we can say, okay, if I just hit kind of the enter key, which is what a lot of people do by default, it now does the fade out on all of the events, just like that. So if I wanted to undo that, I'll make this just a little bigger so it's a little more obvious to see. We'll slide this over just. So let's go ahead and undo that processing. So where I wanted the fade out just to be on the very end, it's now on the third one, it applied it to all of the files. So let's go ahead and we'll do that again. And when we do our fade out, let's say we'll just do our fade out, and I only want it for the selected one, I would just click on new version. And when you click on new version, the other ones won't do the fade out. Just that one. And what it actually does is creates a new audio file to play back in its place. Now, this is one of those windows, and we see this in a lot of different software where you get the, don't show me this window again type message. So let's say if I've done this, and let's adjust our fade out one more time. And let's say I just click, please don't ask again. And I hit continue. And let's say I wanted it to have that window appear. If you go to the preferences, and if you go to editing audio, you could actually set the preference here on processing shared clips. So you could actually open the options dialog to pull that box if you always wanted to create a new version, or if you wanted to process, existing clips, meaning it would process everything. So if you run into situations where perhaps you just deactivated that window and want it back to set accordingly for the situation, you could just simply choose, and again, this is preferences, editing audio, and then on processing shared clips, you can have that set there. And that way you could actually have it configured how you want to. So that way you could have the third instance do different processing of the same audio file without affecting the first, second, and fourth instance of it. All right, so I'm just going to read through a couple comments and then we'll move on. I see a question, is this Cubase Pro? That's the version I'm using for demonstration, yes. Okay, so I'm seeing a question, is there a way to hot swap audio samples? For example, when setting drums, I drop the samples onto the arranger zone, but I do not like the samples. I have to delete and place all the samples in manual. So let's say I've placed this same, let's say I wanted to replace this particular drum loop with another drum loop. Okay, so this is a way of hot swapping samples. So I could take any other drum loop And let's say I drag it over top, and I'm going to hold down the shift key. And when I hold down the shift key and drag it over top, we'll get this little dialog box that says, do you want to modify the events that refer to the same material? So we could say only this, but if you used a wrong, let's say the wrong kick drum sample, the wrong sample, and you want to replace it throughout the project, at this point you could just say all, and it will automatically replace and do what you asked for, a hot swap, to actually go through all of the different instances of that particular audio file and replace it with the new instance. So again, just drag it over to the beginning, hold down the shift key, choose all, and then all the samples that refer to that particular audio file in the project window will be replaced and automatically updated. So it's a great tool for, especially if you're doing like film work, for replacing different sound effects or drum loops or kicks, you know, very fast and easy to do. All right, so you see a question. I'm getting a strange noise in Cubase. It seems that it is caused by compressor plugins, even with audio stopped. Without the plugins, the noise is gone. Is this normal? It could be, you know, and it could be depending upon the gain structure. And you mentioned compressor plugins specifically. So if you come here and let's say I have my dynamics, and let's open up just our typical compressor plugin. And one of the things that you could do in compressor plugins is, you know, where you could actually make up gain. So if you have, you know, your gain, you know, kind of just cranked up, you know, so let's say you just kind of go to your output gain on your compressor, that could add, you know, significantly, you know, sometimes you could add like, you know, you see like auto gain here, but if you have the compressor cranked up like 24 dB, it could cause some noise, and it might be kind of inflating the gain structure of your signal unnecessarily. So if you're hearing noise because of the compressor, you know, try to, you know, often you'll have a makeup gain that's automatically set. You may want to turn that on and see if that turns it off. But if you have the gain cranked really high, just try to dial that down, because it's, you know, it could be adding 24 dB of gain on what's already kind of a hot signal. So that would kind of lead me to think, you know, to adjust the gain on a compressor plugin, that would do the trick for you. We have a question. Is a Wavelab question okay? It sure is. So you can go ahead and ask Wavelab questions. We might do those towards the end. We'll get through the Cubase stuff, but Wavelab questions, any Steinberg questions, good. Okay, so I see a question. If I get something from Media Bay, import it directly to Groove Agent SE4, how can I make sure that sample is saved into the audio folder, and the audio folder within the project folder? So once you kind of have, you know, it could be, Groove Agent can be independent, so the audio files. So I'll just go ahead and open up an instance of Groove Agent SE, as was asked in the question here. Okay, so if I come here, we could now, let's say if I had this drum loop and I drag it directly onto, and let's say I've built my own kit, and I want that kit, the files, to always be stored within the same folder. So once you have all of your samples, I think you could actually right click here, and then you could choose to, so just on the agent itself, once you have all the samples, a lot of times it's going to be, you could save it independently. And that way, if you built up like a great drum kit and all of a sudden you're like, hey, I want to use this in other projects as well, you could just simply, you know, save that as a preset and call it up. But if you right click on the agent itself here, you have the option at the very bottom to export the kit with samples. So at this point, what you can do is just simply export the kit with samples and save it into the project folder in the audio folder if you wanted to. So I know a lot of people do that for all of their samples in Halion, and they'll save their Halion archive directly in a project. So when they go to look for samples, if they're in a different studio, they know that the audio folders contains all their Halion and all their Groove Agent samples. So once you have that set up, just simply right click directly here on the agent once you have that, and you could export the kit with the samples, and you'll get kind of a standard file dialog box, and you can save it directly to your project folder and be all set. Okay, so I'll just copy over to Wavelab question, and we'll get to that later. Okay, so we had a question on how to set up headphone mixes for musicians. All right, and this could be a really critical part of the tracking process. So let's say if we have a project that we have a live band coming in. Make sure I don't kill you guys volume-wise. So let's say we have, in this example, that I have drums, bass, guitars, and vocals, and we wanted to set up independent headphone mixes. And what we wanted to do was what's often called a more me headphone mix. So to do that, what we want to do is, and this is going to be available in the Cubase Pro version, where we could use this with the control room. So I'm going to go to my VST connections, and the first thing we want to do is make sure that your control room is turned on. And then I have different Q mixes set up here, and we could actually just right click, and I'll just delete one so that we could add it. So we have 4 independent Q mixes, and then at this point we could say let's add a Q mix, and we're going to just put this for our drummer. And what we want to have is an audio interface with enough outputs to feed headphones on the interface itself, or to feed like a stereo output going into a headphone amplifier. So, and we're going to define those connections just here on the in our connections in the device port. So once we have that all defined, I'm going to open up my mixer. We'll go to kind of a full screen mixer view here. And we want to make sure that in the racks, if we click on kind of our racks here, we want to make sure that cues are turned on. And we're going to go ahead and open up our cue mixes. Now our cues that we set up for vocals, guitar, bass, and we added our drummer here, they can all be activated, and we see those as we've added them. But what I want to do is to select all of my tracks in the project. So I'll just do that, and I'll hold down the shift key and select the very last channel in the mixer. I'm just using the mouse scroll wheel to zoom. And what I want to do is I'm going to right click in the control room portion, and I want to be able to, I'm going to activate all the cue sends. So when we look at this, what I can say is I can send this track this loudly to these different cue mixes. And if we want to do a more me headphone mix, I could just say we're going to use the current mix levels. So that's going to mimic our actual mix here across all the different channels. And I want to use right click again. We go to all cues and use the current pan settings. So now we'll just kind of scroll back, and what I want to do is the more me headphone mix. So let's say I want to now select just the drums. And at this point, I'm going to activate Quick Link. And I'm going to send more of the drummer's signal into the drummer's headphone mix. We'll come over here to our bass player. So the bass player wants to hear more of themselves. We can go to our guitar tracks. And we'll send more of the guitar into the guitar's headphone mix. Now, within the VST connections window, we also have the capability of having a microphone set up. So if I go to my VST connections and go to studio, we could add a talkback microphone. So this way I could have an audio interface and I could just connect my microphone to an input. So if I wanted to actually communicate with each of the musicians, I could activate the talkback, and then they would hear you talking into the talkback mic. So we could now come over here and enable the talkback mic for each musician. So let's say if you don't want to talk to the drummer, you could talk to the bassist, guitarist, vocalist, and then if you want to say something that the drummer wants to hear, they could just simply turn this on. Now, we also see a click track. So if the drummer, bassist, guitarist want to hear the click track, but the singer doesn't, you could enable the click track within the different headphone mixes as well. So as we play back this project, I could now switch between the different cue mixes here. So if I say, if we play this back, so at this point, you could set up the different headphone mixes very easily. So I'm just going to turn off my talkback. So this is what it sounds like in a control room. The drummer's headphone mix, where the drummer hears more of themselves. The bass player's headphone mix. The guitar player's headphone mix. And you can do one for the vocalist as well. And what the mix is in the control room. So that's kind of an easy way to set up headphone mixes using the control room. So it's very powerful. And one of the great things is it's actually saved with the project. So if you have a great QMix setup, you don't necessarily have to worry about always constantly having to recreate that, or being in kind of a different incompatible system that doesn't feature recall when opening the project. So very easy to do directly there. Now we had a question, how can you set up to navigate left, right using a keyboard shortcut? The easiest way to do it is to use the scroll wheel on your mouse and just hold down the shift key. So you see this a lot. People are editing and they zoom in and it's like all of a sudden like, okay, I just want to navigate a little bit earlier. So just hold down the shift key and use the scroll wheel. So without the shift key, you can go up and down in your project window. With the shift key turned on and using the mouse scroll wheel, you can navigate earlier and later in time. So instead of worrying about a keyboard shortcut that's super fast, just hold down the shift key and use the mouse scroll wheel to navigate quickly. All right, just going to look through a couple comments. We have some more questions come in, and we have more questions to go through. Thanks, everyone, for wonderful questions. Seeing a comment, thanks for the sample hot swap. It's going to save a lot of time. Yeah, it definitely will. So it's a great way to replace different samples. Okay, so we're just asking, we have a question about doing, explain how to use beat detection, quantize audio that wasn't recorded to a click, as seen in one of the previous videos, but for tunes that have multiple time signatures, tempo changes. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a quick look at that. Just open up a different project. I have some good projects, but I can't use them for copyright reasons. Let me just... Okay, so it's very common when working with live musicians that perhaps you they didn't record to a click track, because most bands don't record to a click. So let's say if we have something that's, let me just hide some of my input channels. And let's say there's no correlation between the click and the source material. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select two different tracks. Or I'll just select my overhead tracks. And then I'm going to go to my project menu and choose tempo detection. And it's going to pull up our little analysis here. So I'm going to just analyze the tempo of the jazz recording. So now we play back. Okay. Now, as we've done this, it's created a time signature track and a tempo track. And we could see, and as is the case with most live recordings, that, you know, the tempo is going to fluctuate in the eyes of the computer. So and it's going to basically figure it out by beat here. So as we would kind of play this back, we're going to have like a little bit of a pickup note, I think, on the drums. Now, if you have different time signatures, and we didn't necessarily assume that all of your music is in 4/4, and that's why you see the time signature here is set to 1/4. So say right there is where our downbeat is. So at this point, I could just draw in. I'm just going to click right on that line. I'm just going to listen to it one more time. Okay. And it's going to default to 4/4, but you could enter any. So let's say at this point it switched to 3/4. The program won't automatically figure out when it's going to be in 3/4 or 4/4 from the beat detection. So at this point we can say, okay, that's going to be 3/4, and this will be a 5/4 measure, and here will be 4/4. So you could manually enter in the different time signatures like that if needed. Now, if you wanted to, once you have this all set up, the beauty of the system is that we have tempo changes on every single beat, basically, of every single track. So I'm going to select all the tracks. I'll just hit Command A. And then what I'm going to do is, at this point, we can go to your audio menu to advanced, and then we're going to say set definition from tempo. And what this is basically doing is applying all the different tempo changes of every single beat as metadata to the files. And now when you see this little quarter note here and this icon in the upper right hand corner, at that point we could have it kind of do whatever tempo you want. And so if I wanted to be very slow, or just like we were doing earlier with the controller data, I just want this to be faster. Or I want it to be more steady. I want less tempo fluctuation. So not to be as fluctuating as much, just a little more controlled. And again, if you have a measure set to 3/4, 5/4, at that point you can, it's still going to work, but you'd have to manually put in the different time signatures. So I hope that helps. If that makes sense, if I completely answered your question wrong, just let me know, but I think that'll do the trick for you. Okay, just going through some of the comments here. Just reading through. We have some from Vienna. Great to see. It's a beautiful city. All right, so I see comment signal path or signal flow in Cubase. So I get this question a lot, and if you kind of look at the, when we look at our signal flow, it can be represented a couple different ways. When we look at your mix console here, we could actually kind of see different components, and this would be a pretty literal routing of the signal flow, where we have our audio inputs, our routing. We have the pre-section where you have phase, gain, high cut, low cut, or high pass, low pass, if you want to think of it like that. Then inserts, then EQ, your channel strip. So this mimics the signal flow here, but it's not the only way of doing it. So some people may want to switch the channel strip order with the actual inserts, and that's a common request that people have. So let's say in this track, if I have my channel strip and then I have inserts going on, let's just throw like some dynamics in here. So let's say I want another expander or a DS or whatever. So if you wanted to switch the order of the signal flow, one is on a channel strip, you could actually just drag and drop and change the order of the signal flow like so. Now you could also have the EQ position. So if you wanted the EQ to come, like let's say you wanted the, we'll just have, let's say, our noise gate, then the channel EQ, and then let's say tape saturation, and then a vintage compressor. We could literally just drag and drop and change the signal flow there. But a lot of people, and then it's going to go kind of as we see it. We have the pre-section going inserts to our channel strip. Our EQ could be placed within the channel strip, and then the sends, Q sends, outputs, and our fader. But what a lot of people don't know is that you could actually just, if you come here, you could just, if I click on a strip, I could have the strip come before the inserts, or I could switch that position. So just by clicking on a little icon, I can say, okay, I want my channel strip first, and then the inserts, or again, just this little icon to the right of strips or to the left of strips. That can change the order of the signal flow within Cubase. So that's a good little trick to be aware of. Okay, just read through some of the comments, copying over some of the questions. Thanks for wonderful questions from everyone. So I see a question: are 7 and 8 insert effects still post fader? Yes, but so those will be post fader. Okay, so just seeing a question, how can I, about renaming tracks without having to hit the tab key? Let's see if we could set up something. We might be able to do something in a project logical editor. So I'll just do a new project. Okay, so what a lot of people do is when naming tracks, you can kind of come here, and one of the things that people always hated about working on computers is name a track, and then you would come down here, double click, name the track, double click again. So Cubase, and I think it was originally with Nuendo, you could just come here, hit the tab key, and rename your tracks like so. But I think the question is they don't want to do that. So let's see if there's another way. We might be able to do this with a project logical editor. So let's take a look. Okay, so we're going to say the name is equal to, let's say, we'll just say background. Okay, so let's try it. Container type is equal to track. And let's see what we can do in the naming fields here. So name, replace, and we'll just call this and let's see if we could have it increment. Let's try this to generate name. And we'll try append. Let me just see if I could figure this out. So let me just see if this works as I Okay, so right now I changed it, all the names to so we have all the container types of tracks for the selected one, and we changed the name to backing Vox. So let's say if I just come here and I just put in a bunch of gibberish. Okay, so now I could come here, I could apply. And then at that point, I'm not sure. Just set that to off, see what happens. So I think if you come here and then maybe do name and then append, and let's leave space 01. We just change all the names again. So I don't know of a way, and I could play with this some more, of automatically incrementing the different names, but you could at least rename kind of all of your tracks like that. And we could try, let me just delete all these tracks. Let's add 8. So I'll just select these. So this would allow you to kind of do it. I'm not sure why it's doing odd numbers. I'll just try that again. Let me just undo that. Let's see if I put in 0. So I'm not sure why it's doing kind of odd or even numbers, but I could play around with the naming conventions a little bit and get an idea and see if I could come up with something where it could do it. But you could do it in odd or even numbers for some reason. So I hope that helps. All right, so I see, how's it possible to save and recall an entire channel settings, for example, volume and sends included? So if we come here, we'll just take this particular track, and I'll just open up this track. And let's say I have my EQ, and let's say I have an effects send. I'll add an effects channel track. Let's just add a little bit of delay. Let's say I have it panned. So EQ, let's do a channel strip. Okay, so now what I want to do is just simply, I could save as a track preset. So if you right click here, we could say save track preset. I'll call it August hang. Hit OK. And now if I wanted to load a track preset, at this point I'll just type in August hang. And now when we open up this channel, if I did everything correctly, we'll see our EQ, the channel strip, the panning, and the fader kind of all preserved. Now you could also save, if you wanted to have that with the delay channel, you could also export selected tracks. So now I can say, let's go ahead, copy these files. I'll just put this onto my desktop so we can find it. And now at this point, I'm just going to hit open. And then if I wanted to import, we call it an import track archive. So at this point, I'll do a new project, or let me just delete all of these files. I'll just remove these. And now we get to import our track archive. So it's exported selected tracks, and then it's going to be a track archive. You can see our 2 tracks. And now when we go to open it up, again, everything here will be stored. I didn't have the send turned on, but that's automatically will be saved directly with the send levels, and you can save groups as kind of a track archive as well. So I think that should do the trick for you. All right, so we had a question about recording audio, a couple different tips and tricks for that. So let's say if we are doing just some tracking, I'm just going to open up my old transport because I have the other one hidden. A couple of little tips and tricks kind of come to mind. So let's say if I'm recording, there's a couple little preferences that can be handy. And one, you could actually set up from the transport menu. So there'll be kind of common record modes. So one of them will be re-record. And this is a great little function. So let's say if I'm just setting up like a live band and there's just continues to be a number of false starts. If you're recording multiple people, a great trick also is to just simply select all of your files and then move it into a dedicated folder track. So what this is going to allow you to do is we're going to just so we'll see this, right? Move selected tracks to new folder. And even though all these tracks I can now, as soon as I record enable the folder, all the tracks inside will also allow you to be record enabled. So that's, if you're doing like a multi-track thing, that's really handy. So let's say I'm recording. So we're recording, and let's say now that I have it into re-record mode, let's say there's a false start, I could just now hit the record button again. It erases the old material automatically and starts from the same point. And if you have it set up for like a pre-roll, post-roll, you could have that set up. So instead of having to stop, undo, rewind, re-record, allows you to just record right there and just, oh, there's a false start, just hit record again, and it'll take you back to the same spot. So let's say I've done some recording and someone played like just a little bit ahead of the beat. So if you're recording, let's say you're here and perhaps you missed like a punch in or something like that, you could actually, as a preference, configure Cubase. So we'll just open up our preferences here. And then under, it's going to be under audio record, I believe. So let me just, so audio record, you could actually have pre-record seconds. So you could set this for a couple of seconds. So even though I wasn't recording yet, you could actually just kind of roll back in time. So if you have someone that just, you know, off the cuff plays like the most amazing part, you could just kind of enable the pre-record. So even if you weren't in record, as long as the track was record enabled, at that point you could just slide back and catch like a second, 10 seconds earlier. So those are some handy little recording tips that I could pass on. So. I'm just reading through some of the comments. All right, so I'm just seeing a question about doing crossfades with with the comping tool. So if you guys aren't familiar with kind of how to set that up, I'll just set up a quick comp here, and I'll just do it for one particular track. And let's do several different passes here. So I'll just put it into cycle record. And now at this point, we'll just hit record. All right, so once we do this and we look at the lanes, what you could do with the comp tool is choose different portions. And the comp tool just kind of looks like a little hand. And I'm just going to turn off my snap here. And this would allow you to select, I'll just give it a color so it's a little easier to see what's going on. And you can pick and choose exactly what parts will be there. Now, one of the things that you could do, and the question was kind of dealing with crossfades, you know, and one of the things that you could do is once you have, let's say we kind of turn this off, we could have all the events here, and if you needed to do crossfades between the sections, just make this larger so you can see it a little easier. Is you could actually just kind of roll back just a little bit and do a crossfade if needed. Now, generally, there's a lot of settings where Cubase can automatically do fades, but you could just kind of roll forward or roll back different audio clips if necessary directly from the main part. But as you go to, a lot of times you may find it unnecessary because you could actually kind of set up the automatic fades directly here and set the value so that anytime it goes to a new clip, it'll do short fade in, fade out at the end of clips. But if you need to do it, just simply you could kind of slide it back and just do crossfades if necessary. Okay, so I'm seeing a question. I had a bounce of like 13 different group channels. So bounced to 13 stems that were group tracks. I set the export as batch export, and I checked off real time. It ended up messing up and duplicating the first group and over. And I have to do real time. And you have to do real-time bounce for each group one at a time. And the question is if you did something wrong. So let me just open up a project that has a similar scenario. We'll just activate this. Okay, so when you go to your batch export, and I'm not sure if the real time is necessary, depending on what you need to do. So if you do your export audio mix down, you could see your group channels here for this particular project. So here, if I wanted to, export all of my group channels, I could do that internally. Now, it doesn't have to be real time. So unless you're doing some external processing, like going to outboard compressors or something like that. But, the setting, make sure that you have it set to import to audio track. And if it's messed up, the one thing that it could be is that check the sample rate to make sure that the sample rate is the same, because it should, when you do the export real time, or not real time, but just exporting these, should automatically export it. If you have it set to audio track and to pool, that'll automatically place it directly into the timeline. So if things are getting messed up, it could be that there's maybe two different sample rates going on. I'm just going to reread the question just a little bit, make sure I'm not missing something. So check the sample rate with this. So just kind of reread the question. I don't think you're doing anything wrong, but you may not be doing anything wrong, but make sure it's going into the same project, and and you may not have to, you probably don't have to do it in real time, so that will save you time, but you definitely don't have to do it each group one by one. So I do kind of groups, exports all the time, works great. So, but check to make sure it's the same sample rate as the project. That'd be one thing that I would look into. All right, so I'm seeing just a question of how to render, it's with Nuendo Live. So we have someone that's using Nuendo Live, and let's say if they have like a whole project that has multiple songs. What I would do in that case is, if you're in Cubase, what I would do is set up a marker track. So I'll just do a new project here just for illustration purposes. So I think the question is taking a live song and then being able to break it down. If you have like one recording of like 12 different songs in your project. So let's pretend that this is song one and it's a multi-track and it's connected to, so let's say this is your live set here, and this is roughly song 1, song 2, song 3, song 4, etc. And you wanted to break them into individual files. So a couple different ways of doing that. Let's just make it a little larger, and this will work the same way for a multi-track or a single audio file. I'll make it look a little less ugly. All right. So if we have a marker track set up, you know, and it kind of could go two different ways. So some people will want to have one project and set up, you know, one project so it's consistent, and then be able to export individually. And some people want to just have one project, one song per project, and either way will work. So let's say if I wanted to have one long live recording, and at this point I wanted to break it down. So I'm going to have, let's say, my different songs in my project window. We're going to add a marker track. Okay, so what I want to do now is just kind of select a range, and I could just choose the beginning and end of my song. And the marker track, we could actually just kind of have it tied directly to the left and right locators. So if I wanted to just grab my range selection tool, I could just hit P and then add cycle marker. And then you could actually give this a name if you wanted to. So we could just come here. All right, let's do the same thing. Let's say this is song 2. So we'll hit P, add cycle marker. P, so P puts the left and right locators, and then we can just again add cycle marker here. So say song 4. Let's say there's, just wanted to miss that little part at the beginning, and again add cycle marker. And we'll say our last song of the set. And let's say I forgot to add the cycle marker here. Okay, so now each of the songs is going to be set for my cycle markers, and I could actually name the cycle markers like the names of the song. So I could just come here. If you hit the tab key, you can navigate to just name the cycle markers like so, so that those can each be the name. So we have one large project that's the live concert, so I don't have to sit there and swap, you know, carry over mixer settings and stuff like that. And now when I go to export audio mixdown, at this point I'm going to do my channel batch export, and we see where we could have our cycle markers automatically carried over here. So I want to export cycle markers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. And then there's even a naming scheme here. So if we go to our naming scheme, what I'm going to do is, let's say I just want to name the file based on the cycle marker name. So once I have that set up in the naming scheme, I'm going to export these to an audio track. And as I do that, okay, I'll just do my stereo mix. Let's just say, guess I don't need to. So let's say this is my stereo mix down, and I can now just simply come here, export. And as we do this, each song will be mixed down as its own WAV file. and spread throughout our timeline here. So you could have one long live recording, set the cycle markers, and then the name of the files you can have automatically kind of broken down by the marker name or whatever name that you want it to have as well in the naming scheme. So that's an easy way of, with the live recording, keeping everything consistent, because once you have kind of like your drums dialed in, you probably don't need to change it so much. Once you have the bass dialed in, the piano dialed in, you may just want to leave those settings throughout the whole concert, maybe tweak it a little bit with automation. But at that point, you could just simply export each of the individual regions as standard WAV files. And you could do that as batch exports as well. So it's a great way of working with live concert material. Okay, just going through some of the comments and our questions are coming in. Okay, just going through some of the questions, some of the comments. So I'm seeing a comment that someone's feeling that the performance in 8.5 is better than 9 with Sierra. So, check out to make sure that you always have kind of the latest. A lot of people have found kind of, much better performance with version 9. And it could be, perhaps different plugin bridging that you might be doing with older plugins that, but I think most people have found it to be stable, and there's obviously a lot of moving targets on the with different software OS versions to be aware of as well. But make sure that all of your audio interface drivers could be a big factor. Your MIDI interface drivers could also be big factors that may not be apparent that could be affecting system performance. So. Okay, just reading through a couple quick questions. Okay, so we have a question: what plugins are in Cubase are important for mastering? A couple that I would use pretty much all the time for mastering purposes. Just go open some of these up so you can see it. So if you wanted to dynamics, definitely check out like the multiband compressor. The multiband envelope shaper is pretty stellar. And we also had one other question, just an aside, that someone had asked, what is the live mode for? And we see this on some of the compressors, like the multiband compressor specifically. And what the live mode does is it does kind of a really slick, innovative kind of look ahead, and we see the live mode here because a lot of times people can't track with like a multi-band compressor, because if you think about it, someone's running 4 different plugins on top of each other, so the latency becomes compounded. But with the live mode, it allows you to track with the plugins with really near imperceptible latency. So just a quick aside, one of the other questions that came in, that's what the live mode allows you to do. So if you need to track with particular effects on the input stage, really all you'd have to do is just, when you go to your mix console, you have your input channel here. And if you wanted to apply effects, and this is another question that was mailed in, like to the recording process, you can now just come over here and just have your compressor on the input stage. So that would allow the compressor, before the signal gets recorded, to be applied to the input stage. So that's what kind of the live mode is really set up for. Otherwise, the latency imposed by the plugin could be really offsetting for a particular musician. It could be, a bit odd for them to listen to. So that's what the live mode is. Now, getting back to the original question, some of the plugins for mastering, I would definitely do like the multi-band compressor, the multi-band envelope shaper. One of the great plugins, especially for EQ, that's really exceptional is the frequency EQ plugin, because that's 8 bands of linear phase, which allows you to process just left and right channels. And what a lot of mastering engineers do is to be able to EQ the middle part of the panning spectrum independently of the sides. Also really handy for pianos. So if you wanted to EQ the mid side independently, or if you wanted to EQ the left and right channels independently, you could do that as well. So you have the different EQ. So for kind of mastering purposes, those are great plugins. All right, so we have a question: if an entire track has been deleted, is it stored in memory? Let's go ahead and just, let's say if I remove this, I delete this track. So if I come here, let's just, I'll remove the selected track. So it will be just until you close the project. You could just simply come here and undo that. So that will be part of the undo history. So if you accidentally remove a track. Now, if you've recorded an audio file, the audio file will generally always be recorded on the hard disk unless you specifically have thrown the audio file away. So if it's an audio file, you could probably just import the audio file that's still resident on the hard disk. And in Cubase, it's going to be kind of a two-step process. So you would delete it from the pool, and then you could put it into the trash, and then you could empty the trash. So it's actually kind of you could have 3 different steps just to make sure you don't lose files. Okay, so same question of how to normalize different tracks to the same level. So let's say if I just have some different audio files here, they're different volumes. So what you could do is just select those, right click, and go to process, or you could just do it directly from the audio menu as well, and you'll see process, and you will see normalize, and here you can set the normalize level. So if you wanted to just process that to 0 dB, you could just come here, and again we get that same kind of function just to do there. So again, just grab your audio file and process to normalize. Okay, so I've been seeing a question: what is my loudness meters for production and recording? I know a lot of people like to stick to around like -12, at top -6 dB. For tracking, a lot of people try to make sure that they have a certain amount of headroom. I know people that will mix like they normally think and then just pull everything down. But you know, I've been using more of, you know, the loudness unit meters, and this is actually part of the control room mixer. So if you actually go to the meter and choose loudness here, so as you play back, you could actually see, you know, because there's always two different methodologies of metering. You know, there's two different families. There is kind of peak and RMS, and people would manipulate metering so that their program material, especially commercials, could be significantly louder. And obviously this translates into people wanting louder records. So a lot of people may want to actually you know, have a consistent new metering methodology, and that's what kind of it's, you know, it was done by the European Broadcast Union. So sometimes you hear it called R128 or EBUR 128 or LUFS, or that stands for loudness units full scale. So a lot of the streaming services, I think Spotify just came out and said that they are kind of, you know, optimized for -14 LUFS. Broadcast is, I think it's -14. Broadcast is -23 LUFS. So, you know, those are those are kind of the metering scales I'm kind of gravitating to for my production work. I don't get to do much production work anymore. But with that, that's a really good, and again, that's in the control room. Just choose to, you can see kind of all your traditional metering here, and there's a lot of great stuff that you could switch between, you know, different meter types from CAT System 20, 14, 12, all the way through full digital scale. But should definitely check out the loudness units for metering as well. Okay, so we had a question: is it possible to multi-out B-box in Hallion 6? Let's take a quick look. So if you just kind of come here to the B box, and choose the mix. So if we have our different outputs here, you can go to the mix. Playing in the back. Sorry about that. So just simply go here within B-Box, you'll see pattern, the mix, and you could even route it to different auxiliary sends. But if you send it to a mix output, make sure that the output is actually turned on directly inside of the plugin itself. So you could make sure that as soon as you're in the plugin that you have the outputs defined and enabled, but then you could just go directly from pattern, again select mix, and you can see your output tab directly there. All right, so seeing question, can I go through all of my preferences? That would probably take several hours to explain. I'll give you a couple of preferences that I like to have set up. And there's really kind of a pretty pretty detailed explanation in the manual for these. For my demo system, a lot of people aren't aware that you could actually run Cubase in multiple languages. My demo system, I generally like to have the autosave turned off because I want to go back, but the autosave function is really essential. I like some of the things that I wanted to do. You see, there's a lot of goodies in the project and mix console. So like I like to have enable record on selected MIDI tracks. I don't always have to arm it. And it used to be enable record on selected track, but now you could have it for enable record on selected audio track or MIDI track. So whenever I have a MIDI track, I always want to be able to pass MIDI to it from a controller. There's some handy things in the transport that I like to look at. So if I go to the transport settings here, you could actually, like, one that I will toggle a lot, and you could generally change the status of these by, with a keyboard shortcut. So like I have return to start position on stop. So that will, when you hit play and then you stop, it'll go back to where you started to play instead of just stopping directly right at that current position. And when you hit play again, it's going to move on. So depending on if I'm doing like vocal automation, I may want to toggle that status so I could just kind of catch a word very quickly. Some other preferences, I think one that a lot of people aren't hip to is also locate when clicked in empty space. This is one that a lot of people miss. I get, people really frustrated that they always have to kind of click here to move the playhead. But when you have locate and click in empty space, you could actually just move the playhead when you click directly in an empty space on the project window. So those are a couple of the preferences. But really, it's always good to explore and check out different options with preferences. But and perhaps we'll do more of the Q&A videos specifically on preferences, since it could be such a broad topic. Okay, so we had some questions on pan law, and what type of project would you set up for different pan law settings. And pan law, if you're not familiar with it, you could actually access from the project setup. So once we have the project set up, at this point, you could adjust your stereo pan law. So I know a lot of people, depending on the source material, what they like to do is to actually take their pan law. If it's a very complex mix with a lot of different elements, some people will take the pan law and move it to 6 dB. To minus 6 dB, and that can make the mix sound a little bit wider. And that's I've seen a lot of mix engineers, that's like one of their little hidden secrets they do. It's like, wow, you have such great, space in your mix. And what they do is just kind of manipulate the pan laws. So it's really one of those things you could actually, just play back your tracks and listen to the different pan laws and see how it affects. But I would say, you may not notice it if it's like, perhaps a track that's like 2 or 3 instruments and it's not doing a lot of panning, or you don't have stuff panned hard left, hard right. With those tracks, if you're building up very wide mixes, the panel lock can really help you in giving you some more space. So it just kind of can make the overall mix engine sound a little bit wider. So experiment with different tracks, and I think you might be able to find something that would work better for different projects. Seeing a question, how did I do that with the volume that was super fast? Maybe it was one of these where I just go directly on the center the center portion of the audio file, and you could just do clip gain just like that. So I'm not sure if is probably a little bit out of real time, but I think that might be what the comment is referring to. All right, so I see a question, is there a Groove Agent 5 in the works in development? I haven't heard of any plans. I will be going to a distributor meeting, I think in October. I just saw an email about it today, so I'm not sure what they're going to be showing us. But I think, full screen is nice, but sometimes you still want it to automatically work within kind of an environment as a plugin. But I think once you kind of get into Groove Agent, I mean, it's one of those things that, drum machines that don't do a lot are simpler to use, which is, a fair statement. But, with a lot of, flexibility can sometimes come complexity. So, but I think that complexity doesn't always get in your way with Groove Agent. So. All right, going back to some other questions that we had earlier. Thanks again for everyone's wonderful questions. All right, here's a good question that we had. Just do a new project. So we had a question, it was related to kind of MIDI drums. And I'll just kind of recreate this. Let's just put this to quarter notes here real quick. All right, so let's say we have like kind of kick, snare. And what the question was is the person had 105 minutes of music, and they wanted to take all of their kick drums that were on beats 1 and 3 and fix it to a velocity of 120, but randomize the velocity of all of the other kick drums. So they just really wanted a louder 1 and 3. So this is kind of a common trick, and you could obviously do this manually, but if you have a lot of different music, it could be tricky. So we could do this with the logical editor in 2 steps. So when you go to our logical editor, the first thing I want to do is, and at the top of the logical editor, we could actually define what we want to do, and the bottom is what we want to do with it. And we can choose some different modes. So we could actually just say transform. So I'm going to just say we want to work with the velocity. And the velocity on, let's say, first thing we want to do is actually just, we're going to say our vent is equal to notes. But we're going to just say value 1 of a MIDI note message is the pitch. So we're going to say C1. So we're going to say notes that are C1, which is our kick drum. And then what we want to do is to take value 2 of the kick drum, which is, and a value 2 of a MIDI note message is going to be velocity. And I'm going to say, let's set relative values. Okay. And we'll say between, and I'll just say 50 and 100. So what this is going to do is going to take, we see that we have all the same velocities. And if I did everything correctly, it's going to take all of our C1s and set random values. Sorry, I had the wrong function there. Between 50 and 100. So when I do this, I'm going to hit apply, and we can see that all those notes will now be randomly set between values of 50 and 100. But now what I want to do is set beats 1 and 3 to be a velocity of 120. So we're going to still leave our C1 note, and we're going to click and add another condition to kind of narrow it down till we go position, and we'll choose inside bar range. And we're going to say near beat 1. Okay, and then we want to do another position of inside bar range. We're going to set this around beat 3. And then we have a Boolean condition here. So I want to set this to OR. So what this is going to do is now take notes that are around beats 1 and beat 3 and fix. We want to now, instead of setting the random values, we want to set to a fixed value of 120. And now we can hit apply. And those notes that are around beats 1 and 3 will automatically just be mapped out to that velocity value. So you can see just doing that for, you know, your individual, you know, you could do that individually if you wanted to, but setting up the logical editor to handle that type of condition is very powerful and can save you lots and lots of time. All right, just reading through some of your comments. So yeah, we have someone at Helmet that set up the project logical editor to rename the track. So if you want to send a screenshot, that would be great. If you could put it in the comments field. Or if you wanted to email me at clubcubase@steinberg.net. Okay, so we'll get to Wavelab in just a second, but we got a question on just soloing the sends, and we covered this in the last Hangout, but we'll show it again, where you only want to hear the reverb sends. And again, we want to kind of be using, so I'll just come here, we'll activate this project. Get some samples loaded up. So what we're going to do is just come directly to, let's say we have our mix console here. So we have our reverb going on. So if I solo the reverb, I could hear the original source tracks that are being fed to the reverb, as well as the reverb. So if what you need to do is to, in the VST connections, is again set up the control room monitoring to be where you have your monitor done in the control room. Set your outputs to not connected. So once that's done, instead of soloing, I can just click on the listen bus, the L button. And then you're just hearing just the reverb without the original source track. So if you solo, so that's with the original source, it's in context. So just a reverb isolated without the source tracks feeding it. So that's an easy way of kind of doing that. So use the listen bus on the effects return channel. Okay, so Greg's been waiting patiently for a quick wave lab. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at that. Okay, so I see a comment on, can I do a tutorial on Beat Agent? I'll get a tutorial on Beat Agent done. I do have kind of an older video that you might see on the Steinberg Software YouTube channel, but we'll do a new one for Beat Agent and include that in the Q&A series. Okay, so I think the question we have Wavelab is like if it's a long material, you know. So one of the things that you could do is, let me just see if I have this correct. So if you wanted to just kind of remove, you know, your different edits here. So let me just find a. So just kind of reading through the question here. It's that you have a large radio show recording and need to get rid of some of the gap between the DJ and the song, and you can't get in close enough. So again, if you just kind of, I think if you zoom, so if you take the cursor here directly to the timeline, you could zoom in down to the sample level. But I think if you just want to get rid of that, you could just hit the delete key right there, and that will be able to kind of tighten up your different edits if you wanted to just kind of kill downtime. So if that's not doing what you want to, just leave a comment and we could circle back to that. Okay, so we have a question. Is it possible to create audio for VR in Cubase? And this is virtual reality if you're not familiar with it. And I think that's going to be one of the, there's some plugins. I've seen some, I know Oculus has some VST plugins that are available. But I think this is going to be more of an area of focus for Nuendo as we're kind of getting into, VR tool sets and game audio production and immersive sound. So I'm not sure if as those features are introduced, if they'll kind of migrate to Nuendo versus Cubase. But check out some of the available third-party plugins, and they'll give you some options to start with. Okay, so we have a question on bypassing all the inserts and EQs on the mixer at once. Think that I'm just having a brain cramp where the bypass is. I'll see if I could circle back to that, but I'm pretty sure there is. I just can't remember where the bypass inserts and EQs are, but I think it's global as well. Let me just... Oh, I'm just having a brain cramp on that. Sorry. We'll move on to the next question. All right, so we have a question from a UR28M user who wants to record the audio track without latency. So what you need to do, and it's very similar, I have a UR44 that I'm using. So if you go to your device setup, and then if you choose your audio interface here, at this point, simply choose direct monitoring. And that will allow you to basically, go directly in without having any discernible latency, and it uses the onboard DSP of the audio interface. So there's a question if to have Cubase automatically show all 8 insert slots for, we just see, so if you always want to see the 8 insert slots, if you go into the mixer and you see the racks, at this point, you could just click here and just choose fixed number of slots, and then 8 inserts will always be visible. Otherwise, it's going to be kind of dynamically allocated depending on how many inserts that you're using. So once again, just to the right of the racks icon, you'll see a little drop-down menu. Just simply, if you wanted to have a fixed number of slots, just leave that checked, and then you could uncheck it as well if you wanted to be dynamically allocated depending on the number of inserts used. So seeing a comment that you've always done that before with the audio interface and there's subtle latency. Are you monitoring directly from the hardware unit itself, or is it going into a mixer that you're monitoring? So that should be with the direct monitoring, under a millisecond of latency. So technically there's latency, but the DSP chip will make it behave just kind of like a digital mixer. And if you are running into latency when recording, if you have like software plugins that aren't the DSP powered plugins on the unit, that could also impose additional latency as well. But if you have direct monitoring, it's generally bypassed. So okay, so we're seeing how can you control the master fader in Cubase from the Allen and Heath mixer. So if it spits out MIDI controller information, you could do this directly from device setup, and if you go into generic remote. So if you see this, go to your device setup, click on your plus sign, add a generic remote. Now there's a chance that it might do Mackie control. But if it doesn't do Mackie control, you could set up generic remote. And at this point, you could just choose that this input is going into your VST mixer and is controlling your stereo output. So as long as that spits out MIDI, you could actually just say this controller is now doing your master output. If it's spitting out MIDI and you're not sure what message it is, click on the Learn button. It'll capture that. And through the generic remote, you could have that set up so that your Allen and Heath mixer will automatically be controlling the master fader in Cubase. Okay, so the question was on UR44, can the reverb be turned off on units on inputs 5 and 6? So we'll show you how to do that. So we'll just do a new project here. Now let's say I have all of my inputs available, and I'm going to go to my VST connections, and let's say we have I'm just going to set this up where we could have 6 mono in. Okay, so we could see our 6 mono inputs here. And we want to go to kind of the extended mixer view. And then once we have that, we can go to your hardware settings. So let me just... Now, your reverb routing, make sure that, it could be that your mix to left and right, depending how it's configured, you might have to adjust this down to 0 for the reverb routing. So you could check that out. But generally, once you have those inputs defined from our audio interface, so we have this... So I'm just going to go to my racks, and we'll make sure that we have the hardware settings turned on. And then at this point, for inputs 5 and 6, just make sure if you're still hearing reverb, that's your reverb send on inputs 5 and 6. So at that point, just simply turn that down for your reverb monitoring level. So, and that should do the trick for the UR44. Okay, so we have a question: when to use a VCA fader, when not to use a VCA fader. So let's go ahead and take a look. I think I have. Let's see if I think I might have a project here. Let's see if this is a project I'm thinking of. Okay, so VCA faders are a way of linking particular faders together. Now, some people go, okay, I don't understand, what the difference between a VCA and a group is. So they kind of allow you to do very similar things, but a group channel sums the audio. So that's a key distinction. So if I wanted to take a number of my drum channels here, and let's say I'll select all my drum channels. Now I could send these all, right click and send them all to a group. So I'm going to add a group channel to the selected channels. So now all of my tracks are being summed. All right, but notice that as we do this, I'll make this just a little bit louder. That we still kind of hear the reverb return channel. So I can process my audio here. So if I wanted to, add an EQ to all of my drums, and that's positive in a lot of ways. But if I had existing automation, so I think I have a project that has some existing automation already. Let me just load that up. So if you're summing channels and if you're doing kind of different parallel processing, the groups can work really well. Let me see if this is the right project. So let's say I have different automation that's already existing, and this automation is kind of going in contrary motion. So if I add a VCA fader to all of my drums here, so now I could see my different automation going on. So I have tracks going up and down in contrary motion to automation, but now the VCA will allow me to bring all the tracks down, but they could still be going in contrary motion. So as I bring it down, the tracks that were getting louder will still be getting louder. And even if I have reverb, one of the key things, especially when mixing, is that it doesn't affect the gain structure between the reverb and the channel. So as I bring a VCA fader down, I don't have to compensate in for automation and gain structure going into my effects channels. So, if you wanted to group things and kind of, do compression and processing as a single entity, the group channel works really well. If you wanted to be able to have existing automation that's going in contrary motion and still bring everything up or down, you could use VCAs to do that. And you could obviously kind of, if you wanted to, and this is one of the tutorial Q&A videos I did, was how to use VCA and groups together to kind of achieve both things at the same time if you need to. But VCAs don't sum the signal, and as you adjust the gain structure, you could see the automation still going on perfectly as it is, but will be, as the VCAs adjusted down, you could just simply adjust, it could still be rising, the level could be going up as the VCA is going down, but it will just kind of be able to compensate for it so it's not going up as fast. So if you have existing automation, the VCA fader is really good. If you wanted to maintain the balance between the tracks and the effect send levels, the VCA is good. If you wanted to apply compression to all your background vocals or drums, then the group could make more sense for that. So, but obviously you have kind of a combination of either or to work with, which is very flexible. So we have a question: is there a hotkey for switching the grid type between bar, beat, and quantize? I just did a video on this. It should be out soon. Let's take a look for the key command. I think it would be listed as grid type. So there is a select next grid type. So there currently isn't a hotkey connected to it, but you could do it and it's going to fall under edit. So that way you could cycle back and forth between bar, beat, and use quantize for your grid type. So same question, when I use more than 20 MIDI tracks at a time in a project, Cubase 9 crashes and I have to restart the machine again. Is there a solution? I'm using an i5 Mac, so the i5 isn't the fastest processor with 16 gigs of RAM. So I would maybe try to, render some tracks or freeze some tracks. So, depending on the machine, it's not the fastest processor, it's not the most amount of RAM that you have on your system, and depending on the plugins themselves, so different plugins can take a lot more processing than other plugins. So at that point, I would maybe try, check to see where your system performance is good. If you're doing a lot of samples, you may be running out of memory pretty quickly at 16 gigs. If you're doing a lot of virtual instruments like heavy synthesizers and reverbs, you may be running out of processing power with your i5 chip. So I would try to render in place or try freezing some tracks as you start building your project up. You could always get a new computer, but of course that's not the answer that you want to hear. But there are workarounds for rendering tracks, for freezing tracks, for doing batch exports to free up a lot of system resources. Okay, so I see someone's feels that the VST instruments section in the right zone seems to be useless. Could you point a few reasons why it's there while we have instrument tracks? Because a lot of people don't use instrument tracks to start with. So there's a lot of people that want, that have kind of come up and are, still people that are using a ton of external MIDI stuff. And if you have that routed as an external instrument, you could access it directly there. But also just, people that want to have multi-timbral use within a single instrument without having to have an instrument and MIDI tracks. So there's a lot of people that still prefer the instrument rack to have the VST instruments loaded there. And it could really depend upon the instrument. Like some instruments I want to run in multi-timbral mode, so I like to see my VST instruments to be able to access and open up one instrument very quickly and see 16 different or 64 different instruments, like if I'm running Hallion in the project. And if you don't like it, one of the beautiful things is you could just hit, Alt Control R and you could just turn it off. So if you never want to see it, you could just do that. Or if you want it to be narrower, you could, just take this here. And if you just want to look at different loops, you can configure it for exactly what you want it to see as well. And we give you the option where it's not fixed, so you could just turn it off if you don't like it. But there's still a lot of people that prefer not instrument tracks, but the instrument rack. And sometimes it's just older methodologies of working that stay with people's workflows, and that's perfectly valid. But if you don't want to see it, you don't have to see it. But if you're working with instrument racks, it's a really great tool to see. Okay, so we have a question. How can I unhide tracks? That's a good one. So so sometimes it's really easy. There's different channel visibility settings. So in the inspector area here, or the left editor, and you could again hide this if you don't like it, is a channel visibility setting. So you could just come here and you could see all of your tracks. So if it's illuminated with the circle, then it's going to be visible. If it's not illuminated at that point, it's going to be hidden. Now, if you don't want to do this for 3,000 tracks in your project, at that point, if you go to the configuration, you could also just to the little pop-up bar on the right-hand side, you could say show all channels, or if you wanted to hide particular channels. So those are two easy ways to kind of uncover hidden tracks. So I see a question. Can you render selected group channels to a bunch of stereo tracks? So yes. Let me just jump back. I think I have a project with a number of groups in it that we could show. And this is one of the great things with the batch export. So just activate this project. So if you wanted to do like stems of all of your groups, and this is a thing that composers will often do, at this point you could just do export, and then when you do your export audio mixdown, you could just say you want to do a batch export, and then you could pick all of your groups that you want it to be exported. And these could be 5.1 if you're doing like, post work, or if you're composing for surround, or they could all be stereo as well. But then When you render those would be exported, and you could export it directly back into the project, and that would be all of your group channels automatically rendered quicker than real time. So I'm seeing a question in Cubase 9. Is there a way to open the lower window without covering up the track list? And did that change from Cubase 8? It's going to kind of take over the lower zone, and I believe it's the same as it was in Cubase 8. I don't have Cubase 8 on this system anymore, but I believe it's the same exact way. So if you don't want to see it, again, you could hit Command Option E, and that could just hide your lower zone if you wanted to see more of those tracks. A quick way to be able to do that, but I believe it's kind of the same functionality, but a lot of people had it turned off because it only showed like the chord pads. So that could be one of the reasons that if you didn't use it all the time, that you may not have noticed that. But now with added functionality, it's a little more apparent. So you see a question, is it possible to use Waves plugins in dual mono mode, 2 independent instances, one on L and one on right? Yeah, all you have to do is, I think you could just add an effects channel track, and then just, instead of it being stereo, just have it be mono. And then you could pan that particular effect if you wanted to. Now, something else that a lot of people aren't hip to is the ability to pan your individual track. So if I have, let's say, a reverb sent here, we could actually go to, so let's say if I'm here, I'll just go to my destination, and let's say I have a delay. And even though if it's a stereo delay, we could still actually just come here, and if you want it, you could actually do panning for the sends as well. So as soon as you come here, depending on if it's set up for stereo, you could do independent panning for different effects, even if it's a stereo. So let me just add a stereo effects return. So we'll add a stereo effects channel, and so now let's go to this channel. Just go to an audio channel. Sorry about that. So I go to, let's say, my sends. Send it out to the Revelation. And then you could pan each one individually. But you could also set up mono effect sends as well as stereo or 5.1. So we got a question, when is the next WaveLab Hangout? I think we're planning another one. It might be early September by the time we do another one, but if you keep posted to the WaveLab channel, we're having discussions about it, and so that's great that people want to do it, but we'll be able to do all sorts of, a WaveLab Hangout similar to this. Okay, so I was saying question, building a new system, but funds are limited. Will 256 gigs be enough? I've been running my entire like 3 years, but this is kind of my last week of this laptop, and I've been doing on 500 gigs, and this is a Mac that's kind of 250 gigs added for Mac and 250 gigs for the PC side. So, depending, if you have like, 14 large orchestral libraries, it might not be enough, but, you could definitely get started with 256 gigs. And, there's always great sales on solid state drives around Black Friday. So save up some money and you could definitely get bigger drives on prominent sales days like that. So that's a good option. All right, so the question is, if you have a batch export, then the volume automation of plugins added directly to the wave inside the project will reflect in the export. What a lot of people do is actually just have independent aux sends, and then they do the effects return going into the group as well. So you could do some clever routing like that if you wanted to. So that's what a lot of composers do. All right, so we had a couple of questions. We had a question regarding about using Eastern scales for the chord pads and for the, if there's like for Indian music, with that's non-12 tone scales. So there isn't a way to do it automatically where it's going to be represented in the chord track, but something that people will do for MIDI tracks a lot is, if we have a MIDI track, something that a lot of people aren't aware of, if you need to get to kind of different temperaments, is when you come to like your MIDI inserts, and this isn't exactly what the person wants, but it could probably get you there. There's a micro tuner plugin, and this will allow you to actually work with different scales and different tuning scales here. And there's some presets that you could load up to have different tuning scales here. So experiment with the micro tuner plugin. It's not going to represent in the chord pads or the chord track accordingly. That's going to be based on 12 tone temperament. So I'll pass that on, but I understand kind of why it is the way it is, even though it's not a great answer for you. Okay, so we had a question regarding the MIDI controller lanes, and someone wanting it to default. They're saying it always goes to pitch bend instead of seeing velocity, and it's really, so if I come here, let's say if I just have some notes drawn in, do some 21st century composition. So usually by default it's going to be velocity. But if I switch this to another controller or system common message, and then let's say I jump here and I go back, it will stick. The MIDI controllers stick directly to whatever the last setting was. So if you set that to velocity and go to another part and then jump back to your MIDI part, the velocity will automatically show up there as well. So the MIDI controllers, kind of that controller lane is project specific or part specific and will automatically jump back to its last state. We had a question regarding quick controls, and quick controls will allow us to, and we could set these up very easily when we go to your device setup, and you'll have track quick controls and VST quick controls. And here you could set up the learn function. So if you have a MIDI controller that has 8 knobs or buttons on it, you know, just click on learn, select it. It's going to capture that particular control. I may have one set up here. So let me see if my controller is connected. So whatever controller that you're here, you could just have that do kind of a learn function. And then once you're in the track, so if I go to a particular MIDI track, and let's say I have an instrument track, and we have this going to, let's say, retro log. So at that point, we could go to your quick controls, and these will be kind of the common quick controls. And you could learn your MIDI controllers directly here, but these will kind of be the known parameters for that are relevant for this particular instrument. And you could change these parameters. So if I wanted that parameter, I could right click on it and say send to quick control slot 2. And then that will be the new parameter there. When you go to audio tracks, you also have track quick controls that you could access here. And if you wanted to assign these for like volume, panning, whatever you wanted to do, and there's also different quick control presets that you could access here. Just see my volume pan, so very fast thing. So what it allows you to do is to have kind of a controller with 8 knobs that could quickly do other functions to control a number of relevant parameters in your project. All right, so we'll just move on. Some other questions. All right, just going through some of the comments here. All right, so we're seeing a question about GM drum maps are still confusing. That you may have to manually align different GM maps to particular instruments in Groove Agent. So, you know, obviously the general MIDI specifications are 25 years old, and, you know, it may not be bound. But one trick that you can do is, let's say, if we have a track, a MIDI track here, and we have a drum map set up, for instance, right? So if I do this, now when I double click, we can view things in our drum editor. So if it's set to a drum map, if you find yourself always having to remap different notes and it's a pain and you don't want to do it every single time from like a general MIDI source, if you slide over the edit window, there's an I note and an O note. So what this will allow you to do is say, okay, the bass drum is, you know, playing the tom-tom sound. At this point, you could just change and remap the notes from, for every C1 will play out B0 or whatever. So, and then you could save that as a drum map so that every time you get a general MIDI drum map for this particular, your favorite Groove Agent sound, you could have it automatically remapped for you so you don't have to do it manually. So that's a, you know, it may take you 10 minutes to do once, but it could save you 10 minutes every time you run into that situation. Okay, so we had a question about XMLs. I've seen that when importing XMLs from a folder into a project, it does not make a copy of the audio files in the pool, even after asking it to copy. So if I delete the XML folder, the audio in a project also goes missing. Am I doing something wrong? Please guide. So a lot of times XMLs can be a lot of different things, but they're generally not a method of transferring multi-track audios. So I think, might be, I'm not sure if you're doing the XMLs, is like a music XML file is often used to transfer like notation information from different notation packages. But there could be different XMLs. I'm not sure if it's a track archive that you're dealing with from the question. So it's a little vague with the question. And our question we had mailed in was, so you're doing background scores in a project. We have started out with a tempo of 100 for bars 1 to 40, and after 40 to 70, we raised the tempo to 130 to finish off the audio production. Then we decided to add new music piece between bars 40 and 50 with a different tempo. All the samples, loops, and audio vents get scattered. What do I need to do? So if you run into this, and I think you might just need to place it into musical mode. So we'll come over here. We just drag some loops in, some different tempos. Okay, so say I drag this loop in here, and I'll make a copy, and we'll put it here, and let's add a tempo track. Okay. So let's say set our tempo to 100 beats a minute. And let's say here I want it to be slightly faster tempo, and then here an even faster tempo. So, and when we do this, it may play back. Depending on the files, what you may want to do is to make sure that each of the files is set to musical mode. So whatever tempo I'm in. So if now, even if I do this, and maybe I'm not understanding the question, but if you come here, and now we needed to put in a different tempo value, I could just drop it down here, and it's not going to affect the other tempos because, again, it's going to be in musical mode. So jump here, it'll be faster. So make sure that the files themselves are in musical mode, and it wouldn't hurt to check to make sure that the track is in musical mode as opposed to linear mode. If you see a little clock here, place that into musical mode. All right, so we had a question about an Akai controller, mapping that for transport controls. And this would be very similar to setting up the generic remote. So it may work as a Mackie control. If it works as a Mackie control, that's great. But again, you can go to the generic remote and basically do a learn and say this function is going to control, let's say, learn the MIDI message here. Go to your transport. And then you could actually just choose it to do to device. And then you could just have it do start, stop. And you could have the Akai MIDI controller set up as your transport there. right, so we had a couple questions on like working with video, and a question with how to do some video edits. And Nuendo has a mode called edit mode, which is like really ideal for like placing sound effects and videos. And we had a couple questions with this. So I'm going to import a quick video file so we can see. And there's one function that's really critical for video that's helpful for many people, and that's using the time warp tool. So you could have kind of a correlation of the video to the audio. So let's say if I'm here and I have my video window here, and I'll just hit F8 to engage the video window. So we can see that as I wanted to go to different scenes, let's say right here I want to zoom in and I want an even number of bars. I'm going to hit J to disable my snap. And as I do this, I want to start a scene right there. So, and if we zoom in, we can see I want measure 12 to be right at the cursor position. So if we grab the time warp tool, we can actually just move measure 12 directly to that position. So now, as we would play, and let's say I want that video to go to right here, but I need that to be an even 4 bars of music. I can now just drag over measure 16 to go directly to that video. So even if you've done like video cues here and here to the video, with the time warp tool, you can just place different tempos to be synchronized to the video. So that's a great tool, and I'll try to do a Q&A video showing that specifically. Okay, so we had a question in a generic remote to do a slider for zoom in and zoom out. Let's take a quick look and see if we can do that in a generic remote control from like a fader. I'm not sure if it'll do it, but we'll look. I don't know of a way. I don't see a way to do it in and out. But what we can do, one thing that a lot of people miss when zooming, is the ability to actually just kind of come here, and if you hold down the control key, just and use the cursor and use the scroll wheel on your computer keyboard. This is another fast way that a lot of people miss. So control or command, and with your scroll wheel, that will allow you to zoom in. But I don't see a way to do 2 different directions with a MIDI controller. So we had a question, can we have more than one quantized pattern per track? So you could, whatever is selected, you could have individual quantized values. So if you wanted to, if you had drums, you could quantize, your kicks to quarter notes, your hi-hats to 16th notes. So you could have, one active quantization, but, different parts of the track could be quantized independently. Okay, so we're seeing a tape machine. We had a question about tape machine style monitoring for VSTIs. That's really not applicable for virtual instruments. What you need to do is just to make sure that the instrument is record enabled, and that's going to pass the MIDI if the audio isn't muted. But that's the tape machine style monitoring. That's really for different monitoring options for incoming audio. So it's not going to be really applicable for virtual instruments. So I see a question. Am I ever in Atlanta? We do have we have a part-time product specialist in Atlanta, but I do get down to Atlanta periodically. It's one of my favorite cities to go to in the U.S. All right, let's see. Go through, see if there's any other comments. We're going to be wrapping up soon, so if you have any last-minute quick questions, I'm just going to see if I miss anything really obvious, but if you have a quick question. All right, so seeing in the media bay to see other instruments. So I believe that this is going to be the media bay on the right-hand side to see like native instruments stuff. So when you go to see your various VST instruments here, you probably want to see them all, the pretty nice graphics here. So right now it is set to do Steinberg instruments, but you could always check with NI. Make sure that they're even doing VST3 plugins. That would be, I'm not sure if they're doing that, but I haven't heard of any plans, but I passed that on to our product planning people. All right, well, we've gone about 3 hours. I'm going to see if there's any just last minute, super quick questions. I know we didn't get to all of the questions, but I think we got through a lot of great topics in a Hangout today. I'd like to thank everyone for participating, and I hope everyone has learned a trick or two with the Hangout today. We'll probably have another one in about 2 weeks. So we'll just see if there's any last minute questions. If not, we will wrap up. We'll just see if there's anything. And again, if you have questions that you want to send in advance, please feel free to email them to clubcubase@steinberg.net. And that way, if I need to prepare something, we can do that. I see a question about, is there a karaoke mode? There really isn't one. I've seen some people that will put text on parts in the project window, but not really like a karaoke mode. I've passed that feature request on before. All right, and I'll just wait a minute and see if anyone else is still going on. And we'll see if there's a last minute question. If not, we'll wrap up. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and end the Hangout. Thank you so much for everyone participating throughout the whole world. It's a real thrill for me to be able to help you guys out. And again, if you have questions, please send them to clubcubase@steinberg.net. And we'll see you in a couple weeks on our next Hangout. And thanks again for all the wonderful questions. Take care.